Hello everyone, welcome back to EH's Global Web Talk series. This is the fourth, and happy to see a lot of people who had participated in earlier talks rejoining and a lot of new faces. Please keep joining. I must say that it's a privilege for us today to welcome Professor Andrew Stirling from the Science Policy and Research Unit of University of Sussex in the UK. He's also a colleague and friend, and we work together as part of a three-year program trying to study the governance of socio-technical transformations. So SPRU is a partner in that with ESG and Helmholtz Institute, the Kennedy School of Government, and the African Center for Science and Technology Studies. So that's how we met Andy, and we must say we got along very, very well and liked each other's struggles with activism and ideas and frustrations and all that. But Andy is really a person who has jumped from Greenpeace ships into the academic world. So let's see what else he has done. He was an environmental and peace activist at one time, which I hope continues even now. He has served on the boards of Greenpeace International and Greenpeace UK. Of course, he's an interdisciplinary researcher, and one cannot get as expansive as he has become. He has studied everything from astrophysics to archaeology to anthropology. Is there anywhere else left to dig?
They all begin with A.
He serves on several advisory bodies in the UK and the EU. And he's keen on, his current focus of study is democracy, power, and the uncertainty in science and innovation. So he also co-directs the STEP Center. So that's about Andy, but today he is going to speak on what in India we have become very familiar with in a very, very personal way, given who leads us. The topic is modernity without its clothes. It reminds us of the emperor and so on. The pandemic crisis shines a light on futilities of control. So thank you, Andy, for joining us, and over to you. We'll speak for 30-40 minutes, and then we will take questions. We'll try and see if we can get direct questions across to you this time. Great. So thank you again.
Well, thank you so much, Theo, for that generous introduction. I really appreciate it. And it's a real honor, actually, for me to be invited into this discussion we have today, because I don't think there's anywhere in the world that isn't discussing more intensely these issues around modernity and what it means for politics and what the pandemic means for that. So I really look forward to the discussion we're going to have. And my own talking here on the basis of this bit of writing I did, Modernity Without Its Clothes, I was actually really quite reluctant at first to try and write about what the pandemic might mean for the future. It just seemed too soon, and I for sure was really, actually, to be honest, too unclear. But however, I'm an academic, so vanity kicked in pretty quick, and I weighed in. And one major problem right from the outset was the sheer volume of eager commentary from all political angles that one sees about the issue worldwide. It's loudly proclaimed, the pandemic is loudly proclaimed to herald all kinds of supposed transformations around climate change, inequalities, culture, politics, education, technology. And amidst all this clamour, there's some real responsibilities arise then, not to treat this current catastrophe, which is what it is for so many people outside the circles we're in right now, as a plaything, because the underlying pre-existing injustices and the massive blow of the pandemic itself are so grave that the issues deserve to be more than just baubles in the usual academic and policy salons that sometimes we can descend into. So that was the spirit in which I kind of dipped in with some trepidation. And I guess a starting point is that something that I think is missed in all the self-confident clamour about what the pandemic means or should mean for the future is that the most obvious truth is that actually no one knows. Quite radically, no one knows what it might mean or even should mean. And more than any specific prediction then, the main lesson for me, which I think has been seriously neglected, is that the uncertainties are far bigger than are claimed on all political sides. So this means that the whole idea of predictive control is far more difficult than is typically aspired to. In this sort of globalizing modernity we have around us, institutions like the World Trade Organization, for instance, foremost among them, supposedly sound science, evidence-based institutions of modernity. So to be fair, you know, these fictions and fallacies and fantasies of control can be found on all sides of the political spectrum. There's no sign that the overconfident assertions that we're seeing in these discussions are in some way a monopoly of the right wing, for example. They're found everywhere. So in arguing that the pandemic is reminding modernity of the importance of uncertainty and ambiguity and the unknown, the message of the blog post that I initially wrote on this is really quite broad. And being so broad, I do have quite a few chances of irritating quite a large numbers of people with the scope of what I'm trying to say. So I hope that doesn't happen today, but I would entirely understand it if it does. So my starting point then is to observe that the pandemic is showing how uncertainties are neglected throughout the modern world in general, and modernity in particular. And the idea built on top of this concerns, well, why should this be so important? Why is it so important that uncertainties are neglected? And I think this importance goes right to the heart of modernity, to the illusions of control that arguably constitute it. And it is in giving an opportunity to escape these illusions that this pandemic crisis worldwide might be seen as a pivot point for evolving modernity itself. But what do I mean by revolving? What do I mean by modernity, in fact? What do I mean by control? And what might be the implications of all this abstruse language for practical political action right now? And that's what I want to talk about for the next half hour or so. So to kick this off, I owe an explanation, I think, for why it should be that ideas of modernity play such a role at all in this. And in order to answer this, I guess I should say what I mean by modernity a bit more precisely. By modernity, I'm referring to the deepest and most pervasive historical, social, cultural, economic, and political structures that are globalizing in the contemporary world. But in saying this, a few caveats are needed, I think, especially for an audience as sophisticated on these matters. Much of the most important critical commentary on modernity comes from India. And I should first then repudiate Eurocentric colonial ideas of modernity that are so prevalent still around the world. Modernities, in the sense I'm referring to them, are irreducibly global in nature, in their origins and in the way they are unfolding. Second, I should disavow the singularity of modernity. Modernities have always been multiple, dynamic, and situated. Modernity is not a big, fixed, concrete thing, but a hazy, challenging plurality of smaller things. And like all social categories, modernity is polythetic. It's all kinds of different aspects which show family resemblances. That's what modernity is. So I should say these kinds of things at the beginning just to clear up potential confusion. And this also means that modernity is normatively ambivalent. By treating it as I do, I don't mean to say everything about modernity is bad. Different aspects will variously look positive or negative in different contexts under different views. The crucial thing is it's there, it's big, it's in the world. So in plain terms then, I'm not saying modernity is one thing. I'm not saying it is as it is seen from the north or from the west, or that it is necessarily good or bad. It's simply the historical political ocean in which the contemporary globalizing world is swimming. So if it really is so complex and ambiguous then, is it really worth or meaningful thinking about, speaking of, or acting on modernity at all? Maybe it's just too abstruse. But, and I'd be interested what colleagues here in this discussion think about this, but I think that it's precisely because modernity is bigger, deeper and heavier than other comparable political phenomena that it is actually worth engaging with. It is exactly these big, deep and heavy structures that are challenged by the forced acknowledgement by the pandemic worldwide of uncertainties and of lack of control. So modernity is bigger because it's about as extensive in space and time as any social or political category can possibly be. It's akin in its diversity in scale to extensive ideas like feudalism or pastoralism, band societies, hydraulic civilizations, very broad grain concepts. And this means that movements for change associated with modernity must be more diverse and expansive, even than they are, for instance, against capitalism. Modernity is bigger than, and it contains capitalism. Modernity is deeper because it is more abstract and fundamental. It's difficult to grasp as a category in its own right, as I've tried to deal with already. It's more abstruse, for instance, in science or industrialism or communism. And so it gets so taken for granted in diverse thinking around the world. It means that if we want to overturn modernity, then it is not only the object in the wider world that we have to engage with, but it's the kind of hegemony underpinning even our own critical subjectivities. It's inside us, inside its own critique. And modernity is heavier because the sheer political effort and momentum required to affect it is correspondingly huge. And this is exactly why hegemonic scale critical junctures like the coronavirus pandemic really matter as a fulcrum around which this necessary turning force might be built. So why is it then that this pandemic failure of control is so specifically significant to modernity? What's the link between modernity, uncertainty denial that I've tried to describe, and illusions of control? And this is easy to explain, I guess easiest to explain, and anyone can reproduce this. I'd be very interested in what others find doing a similar thing, by just repeating the method I used a year or two ago now, before the pandemic, to research modernity. Just simply taking 25, I think it was, academic encyclopedias from around the world of social science, politics, history, philosophy, human geography, and just read the entries on modernity and take a note of the key defining features and what they're held to be. So first point is that there's no agreement about exactly what historical processes variously diagnose modernity, but across these different academic sources, rightly or wrongly, a real pattern shows itself, because all the features that I could find mentioned with any real attention in these different views, and I'm not saying I agree with them, it's just what comes out of this international discourse, variously include the intensification and growth of things like individualism, away from communitarian to individual autonomy, rationalism against traditional religious or mythical thinking, scientific method as a privileged style of reasoning, nation forming, the coalescing of nation states, democratization, whatever that means, very cynically used typically, but distinct from, say, absolute monarchy and the celebration of that kind of authority, bureaucratization in government and organizations, industrialization of production away from crafts, and the growth, of course, of capitalism, the systematic appropriation of value from labor. All of these are variously put forward as being diagnostic of modernity. And one thing that's notable in these Western and Northern dominated debates, which I hardly need to mention here, it's remarkable actually, if you look at these academic tracks, the absence of colonization or coloniality is shocking as another diagnostic feature of the emergence globally of modernity. But the subjugation of empires and extraction by force and violence is clearly historically central to the advent and growth globally of modernity. So it's in all these canonically defining features of modernity then that I think it can be seen quite clearly that the core importance is around imaginations of control. I'll just take them because I think this is kind of a key point individually. Individualization is imagined control by individuals over their own lives. Rationality is imagined control, an imagined controlling discipline on what counts as reasonable thought. Science is a means by which it is imagined that nature can be controlled. Nations are the notionally discrete territories supposedly controlled by governments. Democracy of whatever kind is the varyingly fictitious idea that it's the people who control or can control politics. Bureaucracies are procedures through which organizations are controlled. Industrialization is the intensification of control over material processes of production. Capitalism is the enacting of ideas of control by capital over labor. So all of these things, and coloniality, of course, more than any of them, is about imaginations of control. And that, for me, is the starting point for thinking about the relations between the experience of this pandemic globally and how it's acknowledged to be, and modernity. And in case anyone may think that this is a little bit old-fashioned, that, you know, we've all heard the advent of post-modernity, that somehow controlling visions of modernities are somehow ebbing in the world previous to the pandemic. I think it's really clear this is not the case in the senses I've outlined it. Thinking of the control agenda, as it were, recent years, for instance, have seen the burgeoning ideas worldwide about the claimed advent of the Anthropocene, which is a supposedly geological epoch, oddly defined in advance, which is all about the supposed exercise of control over the earth. Rather than seeing the climate and ecological crisis as signs that modernity is in the process of destroying the earth's environment, it is instead taken as a license for an idea that we are entering an entire geological epoch during which modernity will control the planet's own systems. And this is prevalent now throughout not only contemporary leading science journals, but international institutions. So it seems that the control fixation of modernity is very much alive and kicking. So despite then the diversity of historical processes that are variously held to constitute modernity, and while specific details can of course be contested, and I'm sure there's all kinds of interesting things will come up in this discussion, it really is quite remarkable how strongly, I think, ideas of control feature across all these different visions, all these different forms and constitutions of modernity. And it is these ideas of control that the current pandemic, arguably more than any other recent development, has shown to be a fallacy and an illusion. Let's just think about the ways in which the responses have played out across different contexts around the world. High-profile performances of the controlling apparatus of modernity have been on full display. Dispassionately assured experts, precise scientific metrics, rigorous technical models, massive hierarchical agencies moving to the fore, apparently all-seeing monitoring and new surveillance systems, seductively informative graphics all over the media, supposed dashboards informing policymaking, evidence-based plans, commanding policy levers. This is the kind of rhetoric that we've seen playing out in different ways, of course, across different countries, nudging techniques to nudge people into compliance. And of course, behind it all, the formidable coercive capacities of the military and police, which in particular settings, not least, of course, in India, but elsewhere also coming to the fore explicitly, where they're always behind the scenes, all presided over by our natural leaders in the same old seats of power. So what the pandemic really shows about these cockpit-like visions of controlling modernity is not only that there is, in fact, despite the performance, no pilot, but that the cockpit itself has been built largely in our imaginations, because for all the noise and commotion, these things are not having the claimed effects. So what else can we conclude than when, all the macho demagogues and plutocrats around the world, and there are many of them, are proving themselves to be so indecisive? Affluent societies turn out to be so poorly resourced. Democracies and autocracies alike have been exposed as being very ill prepared. Commentators and policymakers are shown to be very short-sighted, and even expert advisors and global scientific institutions have been shown on a number of key issues to be just plain wrong. So that's my reason for thinking that the notions of control that underpin modernity have come in for such a hard knock in recent weeks. But maybe I should step back. I mean, why doesn't this all fly in the face of common sense? What am I actually saying? Control may not be perfect, but it still seems undeniably important. And am I simply fiddling with details about whether control works in a sort of very specific way? I mean, what about the huge programs of pandemic interventions that have been adopted around the globe? And isn't the pandemic clearly slowing down in some countries? So is this overblown, this critique? And you know, the unprecedented lockdowns that are harshly impacting on the lives of billions of people they look very much like control to the casual look. So doesn't this mean that the pandemic is showing actually that control is alive and well? Well, I think we have to think very carefully before answering that about what control actually means. There are plenty of words for the exercise of agency, and control has a very particular meaning when it's built into these defining pillars of modernity that I mentioned earlier. Because for many people around the world, there's very few people for whom there is not some experience of dealing with machines, vernacular machines, all kinds of different types of machines display a very familiar experience of control. Where machines work, you can have the experience before gremlins or rust or wear take their toll of controlling something like a light switch or a water pump, a bicycle or a mobile phone. As an example of control in all these kinds of machines, the intervention maps onto the outcome. So take a car steering wheel, you turn it lightly to the left, this determines just that single aimed for effect and no other. The windscreen wipers don't come on, the wheels don't fall off, nobody by the wayside faints. So people around the world with any experience of any machine, no matter how simple, know very well what control feels like. Control is fully achieving a particular intended result and only this. It's not like influence or impact. And it's in this machine-like way that control is imagined in this core paradigm of modernity, I would say. And what is happening with modernity in all the ways that I mentioned earlier is this notion, this imagination is extending out beyond machines into the wider complex world of society and nature. And it's this picture of control in this central modernistic sense, I think, that is being disrupted by the pandemic. When even the most powerful and respected and self-confident authorities in the world manifestly are seen to, I mean, they're failing all the time, but now they are seen to be failing so badly, not only to control, but even to predict a single parameter of the disease. So how much harder is it then against this background to imagine the modern dominion of control across entire societies or the planet as a whole, as we are being sold by these globalizing visions of world trade and the Anthropocene planetary boundaries? And the story of the current pandemic is still, of course, only at its beginning. Unintended side effects of the efforts at control are already looking potentially even more serious than the disease. What will be the scale of the global economic downturn? How will the health effects of the resulting recession compare with the pandemic itself? What other presently unknown factors may yet become evident? How will the COVID-19 virus mutate and bite back in further waves? So with so much already going wrong and falling short, happening by mistake, or yet to emerge, we're very far indeed, I would say, from the familiar machine-like experiences of control that modernity lives by, that it depends on in routine life, and that these efforts against the pandemic are trying to emulate. So then, what the pandemic arguably offers, in short, is a rare moment of clarity that in the wider, long-run real world of human affairs, control, in the very specific sense I defined it, doesn't exist. And this isn't a criticism, it's simply a fact. And to criticize for lack of control is actually to be as misguided as to claim it. So take, for example, the repeated mantras of evidence-based policy, science-based decisions that we hear routinely on other issues in global governance. These form the basis not only for pandemic control, but for the entire world trade order, as I mentioned earlier, under the WTO, one of the most brutally coercive of regimes we have in the world now. The evidence is, of course, crucial. I'm not denigrating science when I say this, but what the pandemic shows is that it is necessary, not sufficient, to determine governance decisions. Actions cannot purely be based on data or analysis, only illuminated by it. And the efforts to try to justify pandemic interventions on this basis are showing that all the more clearly. So the well-worn claims of evidence-based policy are being shown now to be, ironically, false by evidence. The evidence is that evidence-based policy is not what it says. Control by science is an expedient fiction in service of power. And we're seeing that explicitly commented like it's never been before in my lifetime around the pandemic, at least in certain quarters. So this undermining of imagination is unsettling across a range of different political views. With it are subverted the shaky foundations of all kinds of assertiveness, whether from the left or the right. So this isn't a comfortable message. These comforting certainties and commanding actions are not how the world is controlled. They are stories through which contingent forms of privilege that are actually unable to control nevertheless maintain their status. Control is about storytelling, not about the actual impact it has on the world, but about maintaining privilege. And I would say then this is arguably why, despite the manifest fallacy in this pandemic, as in multitudes of other cases of ideas of control, that they still manage to be so shaping of the globalizing imaginations of modernity. Dreams of control are the glue that keep the modern global order together. And just like as a hammer conditions whoever carries it to see every problem as a nail, so unfolding modernities around the world are ironically enslaved by their perennial aspirations to control. Every problem that comes up is hit with a control hammer, not because there's necessarily an expectation that will precisely work, but because that is the type of story that sustains current patterns of privilege. So, however it plays out then, what this pandemic really shows is outside comforting machine-like moments, the real world tolerates no control. Events can appear orderly for a while, but like the bull in the proverbial china shop, impacts can surely be exerted, massive effects can be enacted, but these are always less exacting than control, in the sense I've defined it at the core of modernity. And between and beyond these domesticated interludes, there's an underdetermined, non-linear mess. The real world is a world of cause and contingency, intention and accident, influence and reaction, association and surprise, and collateral effects, feedbacks and shocks. This is why control doesn't work in the sense that it promises. So what conclusions, as I wind my monologue up, can we draw from this? Is it a counsel of despair? Does the coronavirus pandemic simply herald a new intensification of already overgrown fatalism and cynicism and nihilism? Goodness knows we have enough of those in the world right now. Or are the signs exactly the opposite? Is the present cacophony of overconfident prescriptions around the pandemic that I began by noting more important for its vigor and its intensity than for any specific strand of content, including what I'm banging on about now? Perhaps each one among the current multiplying energetic visions we're seeing across the media around the world, perhaps every one constitutes a necessary fiction, provoking into life these dormant political hopes and critical faculties that have been too long a little bit acquiescent. So, to conclude then, I mean, what is becoming possible, arguably now, is not so much like a regimented movement of a traditional kind with very clear-cut aims around some individually stated, rigidly focused campaign. We're seeing a chance for a more collectively enacted murmuration. You could call it a murmuration, like these exquisitely choreographed motions of many animals, like birds and fish. When the time is right, in those kinds of motions, entire political cultures can undertake radical turns. Perhaps this is why the word, and this is a real curious little oddity, but at least in one language, the only one I'm ashamed to say that I can speak properly, the word murmurations has always strangely linked distributed defense, murmurations as distributed dissent, and murmurations as exuberant flocking. Maybe there's a clue there. Perhaps this is why the word moment has always quietly signaled an axis of possible movement. It's a point in time and an axis of movement. Perhaps this is why, what it means anyway, to see that the medium is the message, when instead of the modernistic idea that action always has to depend on knowledge, especially scientific knowledge, what we have is the encompassing actions speaking louder than any of the words that ostensibly control them. The medium is the message in this breakdown of the normal assumption. So now may be a moment then for murmuration, not for the blinkering tethers of evidence-based policy, but for a new kind of emancipating politics when knowing is doing, and it's recognized that it's doing makes knowing, that the sequence is disrupted, that we don't have to fully comprehensively claim knowledge in order to be able to act. So if they're ratcheted well in this kind of way, then perhaps even these fictions and fallacies and fantasies of modernistic control can be inflected in new, perhaps less hubristic directions. After all, when they're driven by values of an interest of peace and equality and the environment, the urges and the responsibilities to change the world are not just commendable, but deeply necessary. It's the very futility of control that could be positive in a kind of, in its own fallacy, as a kind of civilizing hypocrisy that although we cannot control, sometimes the efforts to do so can be provocative in their own way. And what they can maybe provoke is something far more modest. It's the failure is intrinsic to the experience of control. The failure of controlling the pandemic is intrinsic to the murmuration I'm talking about, a move towards a more modest, caring approach, more serious about the real world and its complexities. Anyway, so much for all that. The answer has to be in the end, as I said at the beginning, that no one really knows what the coronavirus pandemic might mean. It is not a matter to be diagnosed in advance by privileged voices like mine, but to be struggled for in its aftermath and well beyond. So my main concern, which I end with then, about some of the current commentaries with which I began, which I've been seeing in the international media, is not about any particularity in the changes they variously call for. I would agree with most of them. It's that so much of this apparently critical discourse reproduces such a similar style to the incumbent interests that are ostensibly being challenged. This controlling style is there in the critique in ways that clash very starkly with the little that is known about the present coronavirus crisis and how it's going to play out. Many of the critics are as single-mindedly certain, as confidently predictive, as assertively prescriptive, and as aspirationally controlling as any incumbent technocrat or autocrat or demagogue. And it's through this kind of tacit support, I think, for the underlying mythology of control that even the most progressive intentions can sometimes inadvertently reinforce the very regressive status quo that they are trying to challenge. So this is why I'd argue that the real responsibility now is not to drown out with alternative certainties the continuing vacuous claims of this control beguiled modernity. The pathologies of control can hardly be more reinforced than when they snare even their critics into their own controlling efforts. So my argument now is that the key responsibility is not to control modernity, to somehow stop it or erase it or bury it, but to revolve it, to turn it in new directions. And for the pandemic here to be showing this controlling emperor of modernity, even so briefly, to be without his imaginary clothes, is arguably at this pivotal moment. So either way, whatever futures we may now be bringing tentatively into being, the present pandemic does suggest that these will likely turn out much better, I think, if shaped in opposite ways to the current failing reflex of control on all political sides. And this recast democracy, for instance, which I began by just bringing in, not as a codified, intermittent managerial procedure, a procedure of control, but of multiple continual struggles for access by the least powerful to the capacities for challenging power. And it's in this spirit that my own blogging effort then concluded, and I'll trail to a conclusion now, because I think what's needed now is more humility, not hubris about what is known, more hope, not fear about what is possible, more diversity, not singularity in what's being held to account, more mutualism, not hierarchy as ways to organize ourselves, more equality rather than superiority as the driving values, as they are so much in academic and scientific life, precaution, not calculation to protect the vulnerable, and flourishing, not growth as a guiding aim. And above all, what this means is an emphasis on care, mutual caring relationships, not control, as a means by which so many kinds of better, but preciously unknown and uncontrollable futures may yet struggle into being after the pandemic ends. So that's my effort for you.
Well, I must say the way in which you ended with a flourish, that's the kind of hope on which I think we hope that this series of talks would help take us to a totally different direction. As I said, we had a conversation before, just before this, in another webinar about the economy which would reimagine our future, or reimagining a future in which our economy would be an economy of care. And I think we should take some of these values that you bring into this discussion to that forum as well, which we will do. But I wanted to start the conversation, and I invite others also to join in. I see some questions have come in. I agree with you when you say the way in which democracy is a fictitious idea, the way democracy is almost all over the world today. And it's shown in its, in many ways, its true colors by rushing to control and lockdown and harshly push people inside their homes and just not allow any of the fundamental freedoms and liberties to flourish. So we really have, I would say, suffered the consequences of our own reticence to be alert. So are you in many ways saying this is a phase of humanity where humanity as a whole and individually and collectively, we need to be much, much more alert to the detail and nuance because control is everywhere?
I guess, yes. I mean, I think, though, the phrasing of that in terms of humanity as an undifferentiated whole, those sort of grand generalizations are a feature of modernity. They're the kind of performance that one puts on if one wants to control, or at least be seen as controlling, whether it be in the role of governance or in the role of intellectuals aspiring to influence that or make careers on the basis of it. So this more humble, nuanced, grounded, contextual, messy kind of thing, this mutualistic coordination rather than hierarchical, rigid structuring of ideas is what I'm talking about. So yeah, I do think there's a chance, but humanity is not one thing, it never has been, and we can feel solidarities that are profoundly deep without insisting on unity. There can be, diversity. The solidarities can be great in diversity. So, but the basic gist is I do think this can be a turning point, and I'm not the only one saying that, of course, but what I'm trying to introduce is a critique of control at the base of it, of these imaginations of control. I guess that's the distinctive thing I'm trying to put out there, because so much of the discussion, ostensibly on the same side of the argument as I've been saying, is itself quite deeply controlling.
Thank you. So we have a few questions that have come in, and one is from Joseph Brito. He says, this pandemic has clearly shown that our modernity is totally a wrong illusion and is causing chaos. The pandemic is really nature's reset button to man or woman to just sit aside for a while and wait and watch, or wind the clock to set itself right. Is this the best option we have rather than continue with our experiments of modernity?
Yeah, I mean, it's well put. And of course, you know, there's no shortage of don't let a crisis go to waste type language. It's kind of interesting how deeply seated in incumbent political structures the insight was. Even Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's chief of staff, used the phrase a while back about health reform in the US, don't let a crisis go to waste. So even, you know, there are British prime ministers, the height of British colonial privilege, who had said the same thing. As Macmillan said, what does he fear most? Events, dear boy, events. You know, so actually, when you're at the apex of these supposedly controlling structures, the experience of being there is one of being at the whim of events that occur, and having to basically take advantage horizontally of what might be happening in the world rather than determining what happens in the world. So that is, you know, so what Joseph just has said is an example of that. But I think what I'm trying to do is not just say there's an opportunity here. I'm trying to say, in order for that opportunity to be progressive, we have to challenge not just capitalism, not just technocracy. We have to challenge modernity in quite a deep-seated way. And to do that, we have to look in our own thinking, critical thinking, about whether we are being just as controlling as the forces we're trying to challenge. So I guess that's a distinctive point. So I would agree with that comment, but I would really emphasize that additional point.
Thank you. Raghunathan KC has a question to you. Is the discourse now of Corona, quote, man is the machine, control story with RFID, militarily enforced vaccines, lockdown, quarantine, fines for citizens exercising fundamental rights, in the name of controlling disease and fighting pandemic?
Yes.
Is the final narrative of a digital and surveillance capitalism trying to reinvent itself and stay relevant, where practically become a junk Wall Street gang?
Again, a very eloquent, nicely phrased point. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And I think it is interesting, without denigrating, as I've tried to say, I'm not denigrating, because I talked about the civilizing effect of hypocrisy, and actually the idea isn't to uproot and bury control, it's to just put it in its place, to contextualize it, to be more humble about what it might mean. And in the relation to machines, for instance, it can be a very potent way of seeing agency. But vaccines, which are highlighted there in that comment, I think are really worth thinking about. The imagination around vaccines, the idea of a standardized recipient of the vaccine, displaying no different propensities, susceptibilities in different contexts, the idea of an intervention that takes place on a very sporadic basis by a controlling state, and then the population is somehow treated as a homogeneous whole, brought into a new state. This imagination is something worth thinking very hard about. And what would be public health interventions in a more caring mode? I mean, for instance, social equality is difficult in different contexts. Of course, it varies, and many people here probably know much more than me, but social equality is one of the single most important public health measures that can be enacted, including on the pandemic. In this pandemic, it's clear that people who are disadvantaged in all kinds of ways, culturally, economically, politically, are systematically more vulnerable for various reasons. So social equality is a public health intervention, just like vaccinations are. And we should start thinking about it in those more caring terms, I think. Whereas vaccines are controlling, equality is a more caring response.
Next is from Ajit from Madras Institute of Development Studies. He says it's very interesting and very thought-provoking and certainly against the grain, your blog post as well as your talk. And he says that when people, if he's asking, so are you saying that when people, Ajit, you want to ask the question direct? You just have to unmute and ask, because I think there's a problem with the structure of your question.
Hi, Andy. How are you?
Hello. Nice to hear you.
Yeah. No, I mean,
You have to increase your volume, Ajit. We can't hear you. Or come closer to the microphone.
No, I guess what I was trying to ask is, I mean, I understand what you're saying. If you follow, like I guess most of us constantly sitting and watching what people are saying in news conferences and stuff, most people are saying that science should drive the debate, right? I mean, that's the most common sort of response. Are you then suggesting that that response is a response of control, which is problematic in nature? And then to play the role of a devil's advocate, we could argue, of course, from the other side of the political spectrum, that people like Donald Trump, who says, like, look, we just need to live with this, let it be totally chaotic and stuff, at one level, you know, also represents a sort of a less controlled model than, let's say, the science saying that, you know, science should drive it. I mean, obviously, I know you're not making a Trumpian argument here, but
yeah,
one could.
Yeah, thanks, Ajit. That's a great point, and it's really important to just unpack it a bit. So thanks for asking it. So yeah, two parts to the response. One is what I'm actually saying, and then a bit of analysis behind it. As I tried to say, evidence is absolutely crucial. Science is absolutely essential. I've spent my whole career formerly as a scientist in what I think, I may be misguided and messing this up, but as defense of science, the values of science within culture. It's not the only, it hasn't got a monopoly on value, but I do greatly respect it. At least the aspirations in science of communitarianism, transparency, argument, not deferring to authority, these kinds of ideals I think are very important. So the last thing I want to do is denigrate science. The problem is, over the course of modernity, as modernity unfolded, science has itself become implicated in the very institutions of authoritarian dogma that it actually used to, in different settings around the world, be more of a resistance to. So, you know, we see this in evidence-based policy, science-based decisions, the WTO regime, which supposedly adjudicate obviously political matters on the simple basis of risk assessment. These are corrosive misuses of science, because while science is essential, it's not sufficient. You can't base an ought on an is. You have to invoke other sources of justification for decisions. And what's happening now, scientists are allowing themselves, often for the best of reasons, to be used as a cloak for justifying decisions that are made for other reasons, but can then hide behind science. And in this, I think, to go to the final part, when you look at demagogues like Trump or authoritarian populists around the world, and we have many, you have experience of this in India, I believe. We certainly have in the UK too. Authoritarian populists, this plague on experts, on the face of it, looks like it's against this process, but I think it's being provoked by it. It's because science has allowed itself to become implicated in this naked, cynical, justificatory dynamic that it's actually then found itself being repudiated and provoking the very thing. So it's not a contrast between Trump on the one hand or science on the other. Trump is a response, it's a backlash to overbearing expertise. And if expertise were more humble, less controlling, less assertive about, you have to do this because the science tells you to do it. If science were less like that, people would be reacting less, and I think we'd have less wind behind the sails of characters who will always be there, like Trump and Bolsonaro, etc., Johnson. So that's my analysis, really, that they're not two distinct poles. They're actually mutually reinforcing. Overbearing expertise feeds demagoguery.
Thanks.
Thank you. We could exchange our authoritarian populist with yours for a while. Yours is more entertaining.
No, I won't do that swap. I'm
Okay. I mean, come on. Why not?
I think because you've got a worse problem. I mean, we're on the slopes, and it's worse here than it's been in my lifetime. But I mean, seriously, you know, India is, you know, you have some very serious problems. I don't know really why I'm speaking to you guys. It should be the opposite way around about these dilemmas, because you're right at the hard end, I think.
Okay, so we go to the next one from Vandana Singh, and she says, thank you for a wonderful and resonant talk. Given the complex spatial and temporal dynamics of human-natural entanglements, what do you think about the usefulness of using imaginatively expansive scenarios, such as, I mean, rather than linear deterministic deterministic predictions, to brainstorm ways forward?
Yes.
This requires transcending dichotomies like personal, political, human, nature, as well as the various inequalities that beset us. And speaking as a physicist working on climate justice pedagogy and as a writer, I do believe uncertainties and spaces of not knowing are powerful arenas for unleashing imaginative possibilities.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Another really great, I mean, all these points are really very nuanced and eloquent. Thank you. I agree entirely. It's very well put. We at the Step Center, we're just bringing out a book, actually, open access book with Routledge called The Politics of Uncertainty, where we're talking about exactly these issues and trying to look at some of the practical implications that you're looking at there in relation to whether it be migration or financialization or epidemiology, which was written before the pandemic, but these are all tried to be explored there. So I think you're exactly on the right track. I would say that one of the features of the putting control at center stage in the way I've tried to do is that it take a particular example. You Vandana, talked about scenarios. I think scenario methods can indeed be a really important response to these dilemmas. They take uncertainty more seriously because of their plurality. So where they're enacted in this more humble, caring, not controlling way, then scenarios can have the qualities that I think you rightly associate with them. But where, on the other hand, scenarios are used as categorizing devices to label, so you have a completely open-ended, multidimensional, indeterminate mass constellation of different possibilities in the future, and then we impose a grid on them with, for instance, typically 4 scenarios, and then everyone is grouped in one of those ways, then it can become not part of the solution but part of the problem. So where it's used as in a humble way to catalyze new questions to get ourselves out of the boxes, I think scenario analysis is indeed a really important type of tool that can have all sorts of onward effects. But there's nothing that guarantees that. I mean, in a way, it's getting away from that kind of categorical thinking that once they start becoming control devices of their own, then they become just as problematic as, say, a risk assessment or a predictive model.
There's a comment from Janardhan. He says, modernity is not having humanity in it, and it is leading us to an highly individualistic way of life, which in turn will turn us, into a capitalist system. I suppose we are already there across the world.
Yeah.
Sydney has a very crisp question for you. Andy says, how does your position differ from that of post-modernism?
It's not anything goes. I'm not sure about the extent to which real individuals who are labeled as postmodern actually have those attributes, but the accusation of being postmodern is typically associated with an implication that the target is being completely relativist, whether normatively, ethically, morally relativist, or epistemically relativist, that anything goes, that we can't say anything about the ontological or normative validity of different kinds of positions. And I'm just nowhere near that. I'm actually on the edge of being much too strident and overtly normative in what I'm saying. I'm very presumptuous in that regard. I'm very clear about taking a position myself, which is both ontological in terms of understanding what, or trying to understand, I could be completely wrong, but I'm making an effort to diagnose a feature of modernity in this case and control within that in the context of the pandemic. And also I'm very overtly normative about the progressive aims that I'm associating with it. So that's not postmodern at all. But what I am doing is saying those commitments, whether they be epistemic or normative, are conditional. So I'm explicit about my conditions, and under those conditions, I'm arguing that certain things hold. But I'm, at the same time, I'm intervening in two registers. One is being very committed politically and epistemically at one level, but at the other level saying, but those commitments are themselves political, and we should be able to move like we can move between languages between them. So it's plural and conditional. It's not anything goes. It's a plural and conditional position, which is respectful of realism, that the world exists, that there are, one can actually make statements about moral positions that are, and order them in an unproblematic way and argue about them, but that one can move between them as well. So I guess that, I don't know if that makes sense, but that would, in my head, be the difference between what I'm trying to say and a caricature postmodern position.
I could see that Sydney was actually giving you the thumbs up there.
Oh, that's a good sign.
Okay, that's good. I mean, you can actually interact that way as well. He's in Cape Town, by the way.
Would you tell me if there were other gestures that you can see?
No. It was the right and pleasant one that you could make. So we have another question from Padasma. How do you make sense of the world? How do you make sense of world leaders who take decisions of absolute control and destroy lives, and they think they can still control?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and for me personally, the anxiety I have about this kind of analysis, if you can call it that, rhetoric may be more fair in some of my passages, but the worry I have is that I am in danger of diminishing the sheer gravity of what can be done in the name of control. People can be killed in very large numbers. I mean, obviously war is a massive example. I mentioned coloniality and how that's founded on war in its origins, is efforts to control. You kill millions of people. Am I somehow diminishing that? And I do worry about that, because it's important not to do that. But for me, this is why I'm try to be so clear about what I mean by control. I mean by control that a particular action fully delivers the intended result, and only that. And that may sound kind of ridiculously ambitious, but that is the routine of using a machine. We're experiencing it now for the whole last hour and more at the moment. And it's an experience of using any machine. It's Stone Age technology, when one engages with that technology, behaves in that way, that mechanical, machine-like set of relations. So my point about then the control, people can be treated in horrifically unjust ways with massive repercussions for their own lives. But that is not control, that's impact. That's why I gave the example of the bull in the china shop. A bull goes into a china shop, absolutely destroys the china shop. No one would say the bull controlled the china shop. The bull destroyed the china shop. But that's not control. And it's that conflation of impact and control. For instance, the Anthropocene, as I mentioned briefly in there, this vision of the world that's now amazingly propounded in a completely confused way by leading scientists. It's a geological period labeled in advance after ourselves, because we're expecting for several million years to control the planet, because we're messing it up. So this confusion between impact and control is extraordinary. And that's really a crucial point for why I'm not denying that massive impacts can be perpetrated, negative as well as positive, but that's not necessarily control. There are many other forms of agency that we should be increasing our vocabulary about if we want to escape from modernity. Modernity is forcing us into thinking all agency is control. And if you're not controlling, then you're having no agency. And I think that's what we need to escape.
Vinay Prashant, he says, fantastic thoughts, Andy. And he asks, do you already see a social and behavioral change amongst human beings across the world, which will lead us to conserving nature, caring for fellow humans, beyond socio-political borders, and leading to a more sustainable way of life? I would like to add here, the idea of giving up control in the context of Vinay Prashant's question is also the idea of how much care we invest in that space which has emptied out.
Yeah. Well, so to answer directly, a nice point again. Yes, I do see the possibility for that. So I'm not predicting. That would, of course, be massively contradictory to be trying to predict. I'm not predicting, I'm seeing the possibility, and I'm trying to be specific about the conditions under which those kinds of possibilities might be realized, and struggling to characterize them in inadequate ways. But among those then is something I think is relatively, I mean, of course, I'm not the first person to point to that. I mean, Ivan Illich, many people have, well, Gandhi recognized many of the kinds of fundamentals I'm trying to draw attention to, and it's very intrinsic to other philosophies. I think particularly Taoism, which I hardly know at all, but I think is many of the things I'm trying to say are said much more eloquently in some of those non-modern traditions. But I am saying that we have that possibility, but in order to have a chance of realizing it, we have to dig deeper in our own critiques and our own actions than we might necessarily think. We are more creatures of the thing we are tilting against, I presume a sort of critical solidarity there, than we may think. That's what I'm trying to say. But I feel very motivated by the possibilities of escaping. Once you see that modernity is a contingent, ephemeral formation that's only been around in the world for a very small fraction of the period of humanity, and that there are all kinds of other possibilities that modernity itself forecloses by its categorizing, controlling effect, then I sort of feel liberated in ways that I'm sure others here know better than me. But I do think that part of it is moving away from homogeneous understandings of humanity. That we should, part of this is bringing in a sort of nuance and a capacity for respecting plurality and diversity alongside equality. That somehow modernity has forced us into thinking in a colonialist sort of fashion that the only way diversity can manifest is stratified. And India, again, as more thinking goes on this in India because of circumstances and maybe most other places. But no, that's not the case. Diversity and equality can coexist, and we need to really think about the caring environment in which that occurs. And to go, Leo, to your point, to me, I mentioned Ivan Illich, and I think I'm working colleagues, and Saurabh Arora actually is one of them who I really greatly value working with, thinking about relations between care on a more intimate, interpersonal level and conviviality at a social level, that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and we're trying to grapple with how care and conviviality is a social and political outcome of caring relations. In other words, more mutualistic relations affording agency to others. Control does not afford agency to the objects under control. Care does. There's other differences as well, and it owes huge debts to feminist thinking, I think, beyond that. But that's what I'm trying to say about care and the possibility of realizing new worlds through it.
A very important point at which I must share very briefly the struggle I'm going through in my neighborhood, where neighbors got together and got a man who had traveled interstate, and a woman who also had traveled interstate, but the woman had just delivered a baby, and the baby was a month old. And the worry the neighbors shared was that they would infect the neighborhood. So the idea of control, in terms of how minds have been controlled, in how to respond to this pandemic, has made us into such ugly creatures of being controlled, wanting to be controlled, and wanting to be directed. That the type of homogenization that has taken place on the side of not being in a system of care, but an oppressive, almost dehumanizing system of ensuring the rule is followed. It's a struggle I'm going through as we speak. Anyway, it also brings up a very interesting question from Prabhakar, and he asks, the idea of environment itself is a product of modernity, isn't it? And don't we need a new language as well?
Yes, great point. Yes, and I think there are all kinds of movements now in academia coming out of the global south, actually, which really challenge that more, that breaking down that environment, exactly the point you made. The environment is a product, a categorical product. If we see the world more relationally, then how can you separate environment from that which is within it? So yeah, I mean, you put the point very well. I think we're seeing the advent of new kinds of sort of relational rhizomic understandings and ideas about the multiverse that different universes are carried within the different ontologies of different people, and also that society is completely constituted by the environments that it is in, and also that agency is not a uniquely human property, that agency can be found among, not just located within the cranium of an atomized neoliberal individual, that agency is something that is distributed throughout human society in various ways, that all kinds of other processes display agency, evolution of ecosystems display agency, obviously other beings display agency, and the way research on plants now is showing them to, experimental Pavlov-style reactions in plants, showing individual plants to have agency, as well as collectivities of plants. So agency is becoming recognized, including in scientific literatures, as a much more distributed phenomenon. And that, I think, it'll take at least 2 generations for that kind of thing, to the extent that science is influencing thinking rather than itself influenced by it, which of course is both true. But that's tied, I think, to the point you made very well about environment. The notion of this environment is a categorical, subordinated category, is a really good one. I think it's breaking down.
We have made the environment into a reductionist term. So this is a very interesting, and I'd like to imagine you being this. Like, how do you imagine yourself as part of an hunter-gatherer society with internet connectivity?
Wow, that's a really nice thing to mull over, isn't it? I have never thought about that before, but it's absolutely in chimes with the kind of thrust of the analysis I'm trying to explore, and I need to think about it more. I think there's absolutely no, I mean, on the face of it, it's a paradox, and on the face of it, it's an obvious oxymoron. The two things don't work together, it's ridiculous. I'm not sure the spirit of the question, it's a good one, whatever spirit it is, but for me, it's not a contradiction in terms. It's really interesting to think about that, and there are all sorts of ways in which one finds, I mentioned rather technically at the beginning of my talk, that all social categories are polythetic, that we have these words that impose rigid boundaries on things, which is actually, again, coloniality and language coming out there, but also controlling urges to control the world by naming it, when the world itself is far more complex. So what it means to be what we call a hunter-gatherer, subsistence mode or culture, is far more complex than that term can possibly address. And likewise, what it means to use the internet is likewise so. And so because of all those loose ends, rhizomic loose ends behind the realities that those labels are given to, then there's all sorts of ways, creatively, productively, inspirationally, to thinking about, we may not actually, what is realized that way may not be hunter-gathering culture using the internet, but to think about it as a thought experiment, which I hope you don't mind if I do that. Yeah, let's see where it goes. I think it's a nice one.
Please send us a picture of yourself doing that.
It may not be pretty.
In fact, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who's a Marxist economist, was speaking in a webinar before this, and he said, we must reimagine the word industry and industrious and try and go back to the real sense of the word industrious, because he said the problem with the idea of modernity is that industrialization means it has to be at a scale, at an epic scale, at a production level which is so huge it dehumanizes yourself. Yes. You're just part of a thing. So he was arguing for the kind of localized industriousness in which everyone has a role to play and nobody feels jobless in a meaningful sense.
Yes.
Actually, Vandana was also on the panel was saying, we need a world full of handprints. And I quite like the way in which those metaphors were being used, because that also brings me to an idea that Prasanna, for instance, is a playwright and has written many plays on critiquing modernity itself. And he's developing his philosophy of what he calls all of this as the monster economy, which is destroying the basis of its own existence. And he, in fact, went on a fast, fasted for almost a week to draw the attention during the pandemic of this world at large to the fact that you really need to understand this is the problem. And unless you get to it, and when you speak, I'm sort of hearing echoes from Prasanna saying, see, I told you this is the problem, right? Yeah, so we should put you in touch. Both of you.
Yeah, well, thanks. Did you just use the phrase handprints, Leo?
That is what Vandana said. Vandana said.
Yeah. No, great. Yeah, thanks.
We need a world full of hand prints, not machine prints.
Yes. But I think on the matter of scale, there's a double move here. Because yes, the whole, small is beautiful, which comes out nowhere more so than out of the Indian Gandhian tradition, responding to industrialization in the way it did, that small is beautiful. But then beyond that, scale itself, it's not just the scale at which it is appropriate to enact interventions like industrialization, for instance, but scale itself is a controlling fiction. The idea that the world is settled into scales. We have it in, for instance, academia with notions of multi-level governance, where the academic understanding of the world orders brings into being this stratified Hobbesian sort of vertical structures. And actually if the world is rhizomic, where there is no scale at which there are not intimate connections to other scales, and where the same patterns displayed on one scale are not in a fractal fashion also displayed at other scales. If the world is like that, and I think, of course, the world is like many things, but we neglect, because modernity has forced us into thinking everything is scaled, therefore what we need to do is do things at this scale rather than that scale, when in fact the understanding of scale itself is misleading us in a world that's actually rhizomically messy and unruly in a far more profound way.
Here's a crisp one from Malati Adusumalli. Is control that we see what we want to see? Is it constraining?
Yeah. Yes. Well, yes, I would say yes. But in being so, I think there's a need for people like me with my sort of enthusiastic critique to not get too carried away. It's intrinsic. You heard in this lecture series, I think, from Sheila Jasanoff, and Sheila's ideas coming out of science and technology studies of co-production, that knowledge is co-produced with social orders. So what that means is not just in the Elinor Ostrom sense that let's co-produce knowledge together in a participatory way. What that means is it is unavoidable that the creation of any body of knowledge can escape having built into it the assumed orders of society. And likewise, that society gets built around the knowledges that justify the social orders. So why I go into that little excursion is that, yes, control is what was it was a nice phrase used at the beginning of that question about bringing into being. Sorry, Leo, I've forgotten the phrase exactly used by our colleague there. But the idea that, yes, control is about imposing on the world something that's not there, but probably all knowledge to some extent involves that. We bring worlds into being when we know in certain ways. And that's not just true of control. Control is an instance of that. You bring into being these fictional entities, hierarchies and structures and brutal relations by just imposing a deterministic control. But if we look at the world in a caring way, we bring in all kinds of mutualistic horizontal relations as well. So it's not just we bring certain worlds into being only by seeing them in control, in terms of control. That's a general property of knowledge, that the way we understand brings certain worlds into being. And so that's in a way makes it all the more important to try to, like I tried to say about action and knowing, that actually to know is to act. It's a form of action to know in certain ways. And that goes beyond just control. It's whatever way we know. So why don't we know things in ways that are actually going to be in accord with our normativities rather than in tension with them?
The phrase was, we see what we want to see.
That was a phrase. Thank you. So yes, it's much more nicely put. So that's why I'm agreeing with it, but it's not just control. We generally see what we want to see. So let's look at the world in a slightly nicer way.
Right. Actually, it also is about, since you raised Ivan Illich, unschooling the mind actually comes to mind.
Yes.
Not just unschooling society or education, whatever.
Yes.
So much conditioning takes place so quickly nowadays.
Yes.
That leads to Bhargavi's question, which is actually, in the same route. And she says, uncertainty is the beauty of life. But yes, the last few decades have made us very hubristic, feeling we were in complete control of everything, including our lives. The pandemic has surely humbled us, but the market-driven, technology-driven fears around regular updates, availability of sanitizers, PPE and masks, etc., are we losing the thing to live life meaningly, gracefully? And also in acknowledgement of other true fears such as malnutrition, climate change, and more.
Yeah, yeah, yes, exactly. So yeah, I mean, that's a very salutary remedy for the pathology I'm in danger of showing, which is because of my eagerness to try to take the pandemic as a pivot point or a fulcrum for a turn. And in the spirit of the last question, you know, try to find ways of bringing into being things by understanding in certain ways. There's a danger of missing the opposite point, which, as Bhargavi's point underscores, that actually what we can see very clearly in the pandemic responses in different places around the world is an intensification of control. And as you said, Leo, also not just from above, but controls solicited from below almost as well sometimes. This yearning, which sometimes seems to be there, certainly in the UK context, I'm experiencing out on the street for that kind of comfort. So yeah, there's no guarantee that all the various highfalutin ideas that I've been trying to, or maybe not so highfalutin, but anyway, the ideas I've been trying to propound are somehow got traction. But it's precisely because we see the potentiality for what Bhargavi's question underscores, that this could be an intensification of control, an intensification of some of these oppressive, exploitative relations that have been in the world. Well, you know, the world was characterized by well before any pandemic came into it. It's because of that it's so important to try and think and act together our way out of it, I think. So yeah, I don't try and claim that the vision I've been trying to underscore with many other people of a more caring, mutualistic, less hubristic world is going to happen. It's just, let's be clear about what can happen and the reasons for it, and diagnose the features of modernity, and especially the controlling uncertainty denial that we see around us, point to it, because it's in circumstances like this pandemic that it can be seen. People can see that the emperor's clothes have gone in many settings where they are normally kept on, at least in some scraps. And we can see that now. Even people who are far removed from this political position can see that, and that's an opportunity to get leverage from.
I have a question from someone who identify himself or herself as Temple. Many thanks for your great talk. Please, could you speak to the illusion of control as it plays out, even in the scientific discourse around a possible vaccine, for instance? Yes. Who can come up with a vaccine, and where can a vaccine validly come from?
Yes. Yes, well, you know, again, I don't want to denigrate that vaccines can have enormous public health value in certain contexts. It's the same spirit of not throwing babies out with the bathwater, that a repudiation of control. You know, this is not, I don't see the analysis that I've been trying to sketch out as a, for instance, basis for rejecting vaccines as responses, but the overbearing emphasis placed on them, which I think is behind the question from Temple, the overbearing assertiveness behind vaccines, with of course the whole political economy of pharmaceutical logic behind it, whereby the bigger your receiving population can be, the more profits you get, rather than some tiny part of the population. There's a real logic in terms of the commodification of health markets in that way. That doesn't mean vaccines are bad. It just means we would expect vaccines to be massively overhyped in a world where rewards are structured as they are. So, and then I added to that points in the exchange earlier in these discussions we've just had about the assumptions of the vaccines depend on the homogenization of the recipients, the denials of susceptibilities, and this sort of controlling urge to combine vaccines, for instance, so you can implement them more easily. And actually you can tolerate at the level of a state, at a population level, you can tolerate all kinds of statistical quirks that may be justified on the basis of public health statistics, but for the individuals thereby affected are devastating to their lives. So that's this logic we see playing out around vaccines generally. So vaccines are a crucial part of the toolkit, if you like, because they are tools, they are technologies of public health, but there are real dangers they get massively bloated and overloaded in the circumstances like we're in. And I think the question identifies that very nicely.
Sure. Girish Bedge has a question, and he says, we all have an opinion of lockdowns. alternatively a control mechanism of sorts, and so many different strings come out of the current lockdown. But at the same time, he cannot imagine or see an alternative outside of the lockdown for, what would have happened if these measures were not taken.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to say, I'm wrestling with that myself. At one level, in keeping with this analysis, and the academics are always sort of coached to try to be consistent and assertive and always come up with another argument for why, some sort of epicycle, why their argument can still hold. But I do not know. Under conditions of lockdown here in the UK, experiencing things, my family and friends in the way we have, I vacillate. I'm conflicted about how I interpret. I don't know yet. It'll become more clear. It's one of the many things that I tried to begin my talk with, that the main thing about this pandemic is we don't know. And it's been brought to me, even in areas I'm supposedly someone who has studied for many years. I should know what I'm talking about. I'm less sure about it now. And that's one of them. You can, of course, see in the lockdown measures a sort of metastasizing reflex of control that I'm trying to critique, that actually the lockdown measures are just an instance of this reflex of control, and you would expect that in a controlling kind of environment like we're in, and thereby implying that they're somehow not justified. On the other hand, there's of course the implications of solidarity, at least in particular settings, that it is by acquiescing or accepting these lockdown norms that the population as a whole can protect the vulnerable people. It's not people like me, even though I'm 59, most at risk. People are very aware, I think, around the world in different lockdown settings that this is a way to protect people who are really vulnerable. So as a result, that's a caring justification. And I think these things are mixed. And so by identifying control in the way I have as a pathology, not as something that should be completely repudiated, because in the context of machines, it's a very valuable type of relation. But in general, in society, let's step back from it in ways that modernity resists. I'm not saying, therefore, that there's an automatic conclusion for something like lockdown. We should look at everything in its context, in its setting, in its complex relations, like lockdown, and ask why it's being done as well, and what kind of sensibilities it reinforces in the wider culture. Are we doing it out of care, or are we doing it out of control? I think that matters. And ostensibly the same material intervention can have different implications if it's done for different reasons. So with all those kinds of complexities, I'm afraid I don't know. But I do think it matters if you look at it in a controlling way or look at it in a caring way.
That makes all the difference, isn't it? I mean, why couldn't we be more caring about doing the same type of lockdown? Because that's a question which we are asking every minute in India. Every time you open the internet or look at a newspaper, what comes across is the millions of people who are walking on the road. Yeah. It is this morning that the Supreme Court said, why should it intervene? When a lawyer took a petition and said, can we not be part of a system of care? Yes. The Supreme Court responded by saying, but why should we listen to your petition? Because you just collected a bunch of evidence, which is largely anecdotal. Now, we were wondering, what else could the lawyer have done? Because he's locked down. Yep. And he can't go out and, this is not a time for research. Yep. This is a time for humanism of a sort where the slightest indication of, remember what Gandhi said of make sure that the last person doesn't have a tear in his eye. That's the kind of economy and politics that he had spoken of. And here we are in India, where the Supreme Court says we have no time for it.
Yes.
Anyway, Rinku Ashok Kumar has a question, and he thanks us for all this conversations. Thank you, Andy, for making time. But he says, could you share your thoughts on pandemic and its spread in terms of temporality and diverse responses across different geographies in dealing with the same? Are there any parallels with the spread of coloniality and/or modernity?
Yes, I think there probably are. Yes, I mean, for instance, the rhizomic way in which pandemics propound themselves, insidiously, coloniality came in on the back of other kinds of relations that are as old as humanity, relations of trade. I mean, there are people here, I'm sure, know much more about the historical processes at work here. So I do think that there are, you know, the actual unruly way in which the pandemic has behaved. It's refused. It's just blown. It's overwhelmed efforts to respond of all different kinds. So one can see on the face of it, it looks like different countries, and they're looking very jealously at each other. Countries, who's doing better, who's doing worse, on the basis of data that completely isn't comparable until somebody's done a big job of reconciling it. But in the end, I get the feeling that this force of nature has just overwhelmed all kinds of different modes of response, because it just doesn't behave according to the categories. It comes, you know, the chances that people are infected far earlier than the evidence suggests, and that the pandemic had settled into its course long before the graphs started appearing and the models started to be informed by the data. So for all those reasons, I think, yeah, it was it shows the kinds of process through which history itself works. That's why I use the idea of murmurations, that actually arguably the most important formations, political formations in social life, are of this kind. Economies exist within institutions, and institutions exist within cultures. And those cultures have norms and values, and they move, like I tried to describe, as in this flocking behavior, that the stories of control told within them are in fact more small in scale than the march of history in these great sort of flocking motions. And that's what, you know, coloniality came from. It came from a whole, you know, no one planned it. People planned within it in order to maximize their own privilege and appropriation, but the phenomenon itself was not controlled from a cockpit. It unfolded in the world, in a contingent world, in all kinds of different ways in different places. And we're still with it now, of course. So in that sense, yes, I think a lot can be learned from comparing the two on different timescales, of course.
I hope you have some more energy, because more questions are coming in. How are you doing for energy?
Oh, I'm fine. Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's a fantastic privilege. Thank you so much for this chance to
we aren't controlling you, are we? Oh, that's good. You've got some coffee there.
Yeah.
So Selvam has a interesting observation. He says, modernity has made everyone very naked and very dehumanized.
Yeah.
Madhu has an observation, and I'll read it out. So she says, thanks, hi Madhu, for these series of talks that push us to think outside the relentlessness of everyday reactions in these relentlessly controlling times. Smiley or a frowny, yes, the virus is a product of modernity in its worst form, and hopefully also its nemesis. But one hopes that the uncertainty this pandemic has engendered pushes us to make more structural and personal transformations, both within ourselves and in our politics, which are becoming more authoritarian. Authoritarianism that seeks legitimacy from the worst of modernity and its other tradition, or the othering tradition. So she says, thank you again for your clear and searching and sharing of ideas.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question from Rahul Datar, and he says, while the pandemic has taught us many things, particularly on how the natural environment has yielded in the absence or reduction of impacts, my concern is that with the global economic losses, including the impact on the livelihoods of many, which is being faced by all, the world is going to go back to business as usual, rather more aggressively to make up for the same. Yes. The control of modernity may be coming back at us with more strength. And he asks for your views. I want to add a point here that, you know, there has been a debate here about opening out of public transport, but then how do you do the pejorative term of social distancing, which we don't like because it's so dangerous to use, especially in a caste class stratified Indian context.
Yes.
WHO uses it without even an apology, and which is strange that, you know, they're not corrected it yet. But when you open up a public transport system, it will collapse because it cannot work unless it is densely packed. The economies of public transport systems don't work that way. So to Rahul's question, I add this.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And as you say, Leon, specifically in relation to public transport, there are real signs of the doubling down of this moves, atomized neoliberal moves, privatizing, segregating, stratifying. Those forces are at work, I think, in many different settings. It's interesting hearing about it in India. It's certainly true in the UK as well, that people are talking about massive increase in use of automobiles in cities that otherwise have got pretty good infrastructures for public transport, like London. So yeah, it is absolutely the case that we could see this doubling down on some of these corrosive forces already at work before the pandemic, that they will be intensified and accelerated by the pandemic experience. And that's a really great reason. But that's a reason for challenging back. You know, that's not a reason to acquiesce. It's a reason to really say, well, hang on a minute, and try and find opportunities. And the emperor without clothes opportunity here, I think, is to show to people who are not the usual suspects, people who are normally quite sympathetic to these illusions of control that are propounded, but then seeing quite how manifestly they have been falsified by the pandemic, is an opportunity for those of us who want to resist the privatization, segregation, stratification processes that, for instance, come out in public transport, and make an argument for a different kind of society. And of course, it's a longer term. I mean, the stakes are high here. We're talking about secular historical epochs of quite a long duration. So we don't, yes, it may be the case that there'll be an immediate response of the kind on the public transport you say, Leo, but and we may lose on that in the short run, but let's not be demoralized and give up because of that kind of process on the micro scale, because actually a shift towards seeing through control and undermining the hegemony of control that's underneath modernity maybe can see us through that, and we can have a period when it's very grim in terms of concrete things like public transport, and yet on the other side a sensibility about, for instance, masks as an example, going back to the point earlier about this control care reflex, that the wearing of masks in a lot of settings like the UK is almost just assumed to be a way to protect yourself. But actually, as East Asian countries especially have practiced it, going back in other pandemics, the wearing of masks is a way to protect others. And so how you think about the mask wearing on the face of it is the same thing, but how one wears a mask, why one wears a mask, how we share our reasons for it, have a formative effect on the kind of society. It's co-production at work. The kind of understandings we have about why we're acting in this way actually have an effect on the future of our actions and the collective effects of our actions. So even in the context of public transport, and thinking about that simple thing about not just wearing a mask, but how they're worn, can be a way of bringing in this sensibility of care in a situation that's otherwise looking pretty grim, more control dominated.
Okay, I think we should wind up soon, so I'll just take one more question, and this is from Preeta. Well, good question, but very, what should I say, very disturbing question, which we are all going through. Of course, Suprabha, I see that you want to comment. We'll definitely allow if you want to directly comment. But first, the question from Preeta is, will fear and control become part and parcel of the new normal?
Will fear and control become part and parcel of the new normal? Well, that's an invitation to a prediction, which I'm trying to disavow. I realize that it's a rhetorical one. It's a very nice one, because that is precisely the danger. As we've touched on several times, that's a very nicely expressed nub of a question here. Yes, it could do. And that's why it's worth fighting against.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And all this is part of that struggle to resist and have a dissenting voice be heard, and probably gather strength in the sense of solidarities that you speak of, Andy.
Yes.
Suprabha, would you like to make the comment? You'll have to unmute.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. We could also see you if you turn the mic. Turn the mic. That's okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
Hi.
Well, you're sitting on a beach or what?
I'm 10 floors high on in an apartment building locked down in Bangalore. I should be in the forest, actually. So, I'm really, really happy to be able to attend this talk. And there's a question that's been mulling in my head for a long time. I work with forest conservation, is the idea of toxic mimics. And one of the things I've been looking at is, like, for instance, how this extraordinary diversity in the natural world, all beings, agents of their own lives, and also causing change, impacting other lives, has been taken to its opposite extreme in this modern world that you describe. You know, so a toxic, I mean, we all understand what a toxic mimic is. So war would be a toxic mimic of clay. You know, rape is a toxic mimic of sex. The culture of consumerism is a toxic mimic of this extraordinary diversity of the natural world, where you can just go and help yourself to anything and anywhere. So the caste system has taken this extraordinary diversity and then turned it on its head, you know, made it vertical. So the propensity to do that, to me, seems to be actually an outcome of patriarchy. So I was curious that you had not used the word patriarchy all this time. And
No.
Patriarchy as the masculine dominant imperative that has been there in cultures for 10,000 years, not in all cultures. There's thousands of cultures in the world where patriarchy is not the dominant controlling force that is destroying, that is hell-bent on enslaving and not just destroying. So it requires a whole system below you. So patriarchy, human supremacy, and the disconnect from something that's you know, magically just there, all beings with agency. So I was curious about how you saw this disjunct from being you know, in the natural world and then in civilization.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's another, what a wonderful set of comments, you guys. I hope I can come and join some of these other discussions in the future, because it's great. Yeah, I think that's I mean, you were very gracious in the way you raised it. It wasn't a criticism, but I think it is a criticism of what I said, because I characterized modernity in a fashion which I found, and patriarchy, for good and bad reasons. First of all, because of the blindness to patriarchy that there is in this intellectual life, has blinded thinkers to it, I think, but also because patriarchy is clearly a formation that isn't solely found in modernity. You mentioned toxic mimicry. I really, I wasn't familiar with that phrase, and I really, it set me thinking, and so thanks for that. But toxic masculinity is, you know, actually you can see in some ways the syndrome of this fallacious control is a feature of toxic masculinity as well. And so, and also, of course, there's an irony in that the debt I owe myself, indirectly, actually, I have to say, unfortunately, but in some ways direct, to feminism. You know, many of the points I'm trying to make about modernity are very well explored and originate in various strands of feminist critique, especially the point about care and control. Although I don't think it's counterposed to control in exactly the way I'm doing, but nonetheless, there's a huge debt there, which I arguably have not, so I've at the same time not really put patriarchy at center stage, and I've not as fully acknowledged as maybe I should the debt of this kind of analysis to feminism. So I take, they weren't, you were gracious as I say, but I think they are valid critiques of what I've said and the way I've said it. But nonetheless, in the end, it comes to the same point, I think, and there are deeper structures even than modernity. And I think we have to not just feel complacent when we bandy around terms like modernity. There are other deeper formations of oppression, deeper ingrained in culture, that are all the more important to uproot. But in the end, I think, and I would be interested in your view on this really, they lead to a conclusion that's quite similar. I do have a faith, maybe it's a naive one, that by challenging control in the fashion I'm talking about, all kinds of oppressions are challenged, including patriarchal oppression, as well as racist oppression, caste, class oppressions of other kinds as well.
Wow. I think we should call it a day for you and for us, because we have been in this forum for an hour and 40 minutes now.
Yep.
If we make you talk more than this, then I think that would be unfair to you. Though there are.
Unfair to you guys, I think, to have me pontificate.
No. We have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
This amazing way to actually connect to you from there. And I must say that there are people here from Ghana, from South Africa, from across Asia, and of course all over India. So, you know, that's a sense of solidarity which we did not know existed in many ways. So I think we are reinventing the world, hopefully, as we called this series in resilient and inclusive ways. So yeah, thank you, Andy, and thanks so much for your. I must say that his paper is online, and we will share the link to all those who have signed up. It's a must read, and please take time reading it. It takes a real good while to read it, but it's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to everyone. I really got a huge amount out. I'll be thinking about it for a while. So thank you very much.
Yes, sure. And before we part, and next talk next Friday will be by a good friend from Bangalore, Prem Chandavarkar. He's a leading architect, and he's going to discuss 7 lessons we can learn in how we have interacted with this pandemic. And the week after that, we'll have a friend from Kenya. His name is Odunde Lumumba. He works with the African Land Alliance. And so, yeah, please keep yourselves free the next 2 Fridays as well, because the series continues. Thank you. Thank you so much. And of course, the video recording of this will be online. Please do feel free to share it. It will be available on ESG's YouTube channel. And also the link will be available on esgindia.org. Yeah. Thank you, Andy. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All the best to everyone.